The 18-year-old sat across from the investigator, his hands rested flat on the table, his back straight, his voice without a single tremor. The interrogation room camera captured his every movement, and there were almost no movements to capture. To the question, "Did you do it?" he answered without a pause, without the slightest hesitation. "Yes." The investigator clarified. "With a weapon?" "Yes." "Multiple strikes?" "Yes." "She was 13? "Yes." Without remorse, without bravado, in the even tone of a person recounting something foreign, long past, and having nothing to do with him at all. The report was filled out quickly. The suspect didn't dispute a single point, didn't ask for a lawyer, didn't demand a break, didn't cry. The investigator noted on the form, cooperative, mentally competent, oriented in time and space. Obtained in the first hours, and this is an important detail because usually at this stage a case gains speed. There's a confession, there's a weapon, there's a location, everything needed to move forward without delay. But this interrogation got firmly stuck on one question that the investigator asked 3 times, each time with a new phrasing, with different intonation, through pauses. The answer didn't change. The question was simple: why? And here, the person who had just calmly recited every fact, every detail, every one of his own actions, stopped and couldn't find an answer. This is precisely the center of the entire story. He didn't say, "I don't remember," didn't say, quote 9, didn't try to shift the blame onto someone else, onto circumstances, onto alcohol, onto chance. The 18-year-old looked at the investigator and stated evenly, "I don't know why I did it." It wasn't a ploy and not an attempt to buy time or confuse the course of the investigation. He answered everything clearly and in order, where exactly he stood, what he held in his hand, how many times he struck and where. But when the conversation reached quote _11_, he stopped. Not like a person hiding something and afraid of betraying himself with an extra word, but like a person who genuinely cannot find an answer within himself. Officially, no motive has been established based on the suspect's statements, and this is a rarity. In most similar cases, the motive is obvious within the first minutes. Here, nothing, emptiness where the cause should be. And this emptiness isn't a footnote in the margins, not a routine technical complication of the investigation. It's the main question of the entire investigation, because when a person does what he did and cannot himself explain why, that's significantly more frightening than any comprehensible motive. This entire video is an attempt to find the answer that the investigator himself couldn't provide. But to search, you first need to understand who Sonia was, what happened in the village of Kez. Kez is an urban-type settlement in the north of Udmurtia. The population is just over 10,000 people, one central street, a few schools, a railway station that was once the main employer for the entire district. The portrait of such places: here everyone knows each other, not just by name but by family, whose son, whose daughter, who's friends with whom, who lives where, and what happens behind the neighbor's door. News here spreads faster than the internet, over fences, through stairwells, at the registers of the local magnet store, the night of March 14th to 15th, 2026, a Friday, March cold, the streets empty. Probably the lights in most windows were already off. This working settlement goes to bed by alarm clock without extra nighttime walks. But in one home, the lights weren't turned off. Mom was waiting. Sonia hadn't come back by nightfall. The phone was silent. For a big city, this is the ordinary anxiety of teenage years, almost a weekend norm. For Kez, it's a signal of a different kind. There's nowhere to disappear to here. No nightclubs, no 24-hour establishments, no unfamiliar neighborhoods with strangers. Midnight means something happened. And Mom understood this immediately. Probably she first called girlfriends, relatives, neighbors, everyone she knew, and then dialed the number that in such settlements is dialed last, the police. Those who knew Sonia described her the same way: positive, open, and with character. Not quiet, not withdrawn, the type who's the first to approach and introduce herself, the first to stand up for friends, the first to say what she thinks out loud without putting it off. At school, she had a clear reputation. She could stand up for herself. Not a bully, not a troublemaker, just a person you couldn't intimidate, someone who wouldn't stay silent where another might. This veered toward brave. That word was repeated by everyone who spoke about her. She had many friends, not a group of 2 or 3 people, but a wide circle. People knew her, people loved her, people wanted to spend time with her. Her uncle, Artyom Lekomtsev, who would later tell investigators his version of what happened. This version would turn out to be more important for understanding the whole picture. The family was ordinary, settlement style, solid. Sonia wasn't a troubled teenager, didn't run away from home, didn't get into trouble. Everything known about her paints a portrait of a normal, healthy, happy life, exactly the kind that most live in such settlements, when the world seems understandable and safe, especially in a place where everyone knows each other. There was something the closest ones knew. One circumstance that the family kept in mind and didn't talk about out loud in front of outsiders. And it's precisely this that would play an important role. From birth, Sonia lived with a heart defect, a diagnosis so serious that she was fitted with artificial valves, restrictions that most peers have no concept of. But those who saw her every day beside her said the same thing. You couldn't tell by looking at her. She didn't feel sorry for herself, didn't hide behind her diagnosis, didn't stay home on quiet mode. She lived as if there were no defect. A full life at full volume. She ran, made friends, laughed, kept up with peers. She dreamed of becoming a veterinarian or a doctor, hadn't yet decided definitively the direction, but she felt it for sure. She loved animals, not abstractly, but concretely. At home there lived a male cat, a female cat, a rabbit, a guinea pig, hamsters, an entire zoo in a settlement apartment. Most likely it was her own experience with doctors that pushed her toward this dream. She knew from the inside what it's like when your life depends on others' hands and others' decisions, and she wanted to be on the other side, to help and not wait for help. The heart that, by all medical forecasts, could fail at any moment, held on. And Sonia survived the operations, survived everything that statistically could have stopped her. She called the doctor's forecasts into question and lived on, as if there were still much time and many plans ahead. But it wasn't her heart that stopped her. Mom called the police that same night. The duty officer accepted the report. A minor was missing. Such calls are a rarity, and they're treated differently here than in a megacity, where this is the routine of a night shift. The machine started turning quickly, the investigative committee got involved, the Interior Ministry got involved, search groups were formed without delay. Probably the first hours followed the standard scheme. Questioning the inner circle, checking the last calls and messages on her phone, reconstructing the route from home to the last known location. In small settlements, searches are easier than they seem from the outside. There are fewer cameras here, but significantly more eyes. Someone saw, someone heard, someone definitely knows where she went that evening and who she spoke with. The operatives worked all night and they found her. They found her quickly. The count was in hours, not days. This is an important detail that can't be missed. In most similar cases, searches stretch out over days, weeks, sometimes months. People wait, hope. They preserve hope as long as possible. Here, there was none of that. What was being searched for was discovered within the settlement. Not on the outskirts, not in an abandoned building, not in the tree line beyond the railroad. And the place where Sonia was found immediately changed the entire picture, because it pointed not only to the one who did it, it pointed to another participant. Pushkin Street, Kez Settlement. An ordinary apartment in a panel building, standard layout, thin walls through which, in the silence of night, you can hear everything happening at the neighbors. The apartment belonged to the 18-year-old. It was precisely here, on the night of March 14th, that this tragedy occurred. As the investigation would later establish, several wounds were inflicted with a weapon to the neck and torso. Not one strike in a state of momentary affect, but several, and purposefully. And at the time of his actions, the 18-year-old was in a state of intoxication. This isn't a version or an assumption, but the result of an expert examination, drunk with a weapon in his own apartment, late at night. The question that arises first and sounds loudest of all: did Sonia come here herself? Was she somehow brought? Did she know where she was going and to whom exactly? And answers to this question, the investigation reconstructed minute by minute, questioning everyone who could have seen or heard anything. But one detail became known almost immediately, and it instantly turned the whole picture upside down. On Pushkin Street that night, there weren't two people, there were three. And the third person wasn't a random witness who happened to be in the wrong place. Their role in what happened, the investigation would clarify separately. In that apartment was the 16-year-old girlfriend of the 18-year-old, not in the next room, not behind a closed door, not in the hallway, right there, in the same space. And she saw what was happening. She saw the weapon, Sonia, every action from start to finish, and she did nothing. She didn't scream, didn't try to stop it, didn't run out of the apartment, didn't use the phone, didn't call the neighbors. 16 years old, the age when a person already definitely understands the difference between a fight and what was happening in that room that night. She understood everything, and she stayed. The investigation will record officially: present, did not intervene. Those two words are legally dry, humanly unbearable. Every sound in that apartment, in that silence, and didn't intervene means she made a decision, consciously or out of fear. That's for the investigation to determine during further work. But the fact itself remains unchanged. She was beside Sonia at the moment when Sonia could still have been saved, and she didn't make a single movement in that direction. From this moment on, a second person appears in the case whose actions require separate evaluation, because between couldn't intervene and consciously decided to do nothing, there is a huge difference, and it's precisely this boundary that the investigation must establish. However, the most difficult thing in this story isn't what she saw, but what she did after. Sonia and the 16-year-old had once been friends. Not just acquainted through the settlement, but actually friends. They spent time together, communicated, were in the same circle. And a 3-year age difference in the teenage world is felt sharply, but in a small settlement with a limited circle, you befriend not by age, but by overlap of interests and proximity of yards. Approximately half a year before that night, their communication ceased. No quarrel, no scandal, no loud breakup. They just stopped. Sonia stepped away quietly, without explanations to the outer circle. The reason became known later from accounts of relatives. The close ones, the Lekomtsevs, knew about the 16-year-old what wasn't known at school or in the yard. Enough to say directly and without mincing words, stay away from her. This wasn't an abstract parental, don't be friends with a bad person. It was a specific warning based on specific facts that the family knew personally. Sonia listened. Half a year without calls, without meetings, without joint evenings. A clean break, a conscious decision that she consistently maintained, dreams of a future profession. And then came the night of March 14th, and Sonia ended up in an apartment where there were two people, the 18-year-old and the one she'd been advised not to associate with. What exactly happened between half a year of silence and this meeting is one of the key points of the entire investigation. The 16-year-old had police records, not one, but several. In a settlement where everyone is in plain view, this isn't a secret or a rumor. The local officers knew, the neighbors knew, the parents of classmates knew. In Kez, you can't hide such things. That's exactly why Sonia's relatives warned her, not abstractly, but knowing the specific history of this family and this specific friend. Police records aren't a conviction or a sentence, but they're a marker that in a small settlement is read instantly. At 16, to have several official contacts with the police means something in a person's life has long been going off the standard route, and people know about it. Sonia, hearing the warning, listened, and it's important to understand this. Because she wasn't a rebel, she didn't ignore her family. She made a decision and held to it consistently, but on the night of March 14th, something changed. Someone called or called through someone else. And Sonia, who had consistently avoided any contact for half a year, suddenly found herself in the apartment of her former friend and her 18-year-old boyfriend. Without a compelling reason, she wouldn't have come there. It contradicts everything. So there was either a pretext or deception. And the difference between these two options is fundamental. It's precisely this that the investigation is clarifying. After what happened in the apartment, the 16-year-old didn't call an ambulance, didn't dial the police, didn't run out to the neighbors, didn't do anything a person does in panic and shock. She stayed and started cleaning up. Together with the boyfriend, they wiped down evidence from the scene methodically, silently, probably in complete silence if you don't count the sound of a wet rag. Then they wrapped Sonia in a duvet cover, linen from the same closet, from the same apartment, an ordinary duvet cover that very morning could have been drying on the balcony as if nothing had happened. Then they moved her. They didn't leave her in the apartment, didn't carry her out to the street to people. They moved her to a garage. But not just any garage, to the garage of the 16-year-old's mother. This is the detail that changes everything. She didn't just help hide the traces, she used her own family as cover for what happened. Her mother, most likely knowing nothing of what was going on, unwittingly became part of the chain. The garage, the key to which her daughter had, became the final point. She's 16. A year ago, she was spending time with Sonia in the same settlement, in the same company, on the same streets. This is what _quote_15__ really means in this story. Behavior, and it's important to understand that such a designation isn't drawn from a single case and doesn't appear suddenly. It accumulates gradually, from school records, from the neighborhood officer's reports, from neighbor complaints, from minor incidents, and 18 is formally an adult, but in essence, a person who has barely emerged from adolescence and already has a profile with which they won't be hired for any normal job, and not a conviction. It's the gap in which many get lost, not yet a criminal on paper, but already long an unusual resident with an ordinary life, and the system saw him, recorded him, checked boxes, and didn't stop him. Until March 14th, he was a line in the district officer's report, unpleasant but familiar, one of many. From this moment, he became the main figure in a criminal case that would extend far beyond Kez. On March 8th, 2 days after what happened, he was officially charged. The case was transferred to the Balazzino court, the nearest district court, because in Kez itself there is no court, and it's several dozen kilometers away by Udmurt roads. The hearing went quickly. The court ruled detention until May 14, 2026. 2 months in pre-trial detention until the next court decision, with no right to leave until it's made. The arguments for arrest were standard, but one of them stands out separately. The investigation stated directly that the suspect could exert pressure on witnesses, not theoretically, concretely. You need to understand the scale. In a settlement where everyone lives within a radius of several streets, the witnesses are neighbors, acquaintances, former classmates, relatives by 2 handshakes. Pressure here doesn't require threats. A glance in the grocery store is enough. A word through mutual acquaintances, a simple presence on the same street at the right moment. The court took this into account and made the only possible decision. The facts added up, obviously. There's a confession, there's a weapon, there's a location. The wheels of justice worked quickly and without failures in such cases. But one element was still missing: motive. The investigation continued searching for the cause, and the accused at each interrogation repeated the same thing: __quote_16__. And at repeated interrogations, the picture didn't change. He didn't retract his testimony. He didn't change his version. He didn't try to soften what had already been said. Yes, he was drunk, took the weapon, struck. No, he can't explain. He didn't shift responsibility. Didn't say, she came on her own. Not a single attempt to build a justification. The investigators tried different approaches: chronological, emotional, detailed. They asked him to reconstruct the evening minute by minute, clarified what he drank, with whom he drank. When Sonia arrived, what they talked about, whether there was a conflict, whether there was a reason, whether there was tension. He answered everything except the main thing. The moment when his hand reached for the weapon remained empty, and a gap in memory, not a simulation of amnesia. Investigators know well how to distinguish one from the other. Most likely, he himself doesn't understand what exactly switched his state. Sitting, talking, what happened next? As it would later turn out, this emptiness wouldn't be filled during the investigation. Alcohol lowers inhibitions, but doesn't create intention from nothing. Something had to trigger the chain, a word, gesture, glance, movement. And if he himself doesn't know, then perhaps the one who was beside him in the room knows. It's the simplest version, and the first one the investigation considered. Alcohol plus a long-documented inclination toward antisocial behavior, aggression without a prior plan, intent without a specific goal. This explains a lot. The absence of an attempt to flee before the police arrived, the readiness to confess in the very first hours. People who plan in advance, as a rule, don't confess immediately and without a struggle. People overcome by drunken rage often don't believe themselves what they've done and don't understand how it's even possible. The version is workable, but it has one spot that can't be closed by anything. It doesn't explain why Sonia was in that apartment at all. If this was a spontaneous outburst, did Lekomtseva come voluntarily of her own will to a person whose girlfriend she had stopped associating with, came at night to an 18-year-old whom the settlement knew not from the best side? It doesn't add up to a coherent picture. Sonia wasn't naive, wasn't reckless, and didn't follow anyone's impulses. For half a year she'd kept her distance consciously, without breakdowns, and without reasons to regret the decision. And suddenly she came on her own, on a Friday night, to these people with such a reputation. That means she was invited. But by whom, how, and why? That's the question that leads to the next version. Artyom Lekomtsev, Sonia's uncle, told investigators his version of what happened. According to him, the 16-year-old invited Sonia through deception. The pretext probably was something like, "Let's meet, let's talk, I've missed you," or "Let's finally make up, enough keeping distance." For Sonia, who had consistently kept that distance for half a year, this would have been the only reason to come. Reconciliation, a conversation, a final point in the story. Not a party, not a chance encounter, not the street, but a specific personal invitation from a former friend asking to meet. Sonia was brave, wasn't afraid of people, wasn't afraid of conversations, wasn't afraid to sort out relationships when she considered it necessary. Most likely she thought, nothing terrible, I'll go, we'll talk, we'll sort it out. It was precisely this bravery that became her vulnerability that time. A cautious person would have refused without thinking. An anxious one would have called her mom back and asked for advice. Sonia went because she wasn't used to being afraid. The uncle's version, naturally, isn't officially confirmed. It remains the version of a close relative, but not to be dismissed. Half a year of silence and then a sudden meeting. Someone had to be the first to extend a hand and initiate the contact. And if the friend did this, then a question arises that changes the entire configuration of the case. Did she know in advance how it would end? Or did she just invite and then something happened that she didn't expect? The 16-year-old is free. Not under house arrest, not under a travel ban, free, in the same settlement on the same streets. They charged her on one count, concealment. She was present during what happened in the apartment. She wiped down evidence, helped wrap and carry. She provided her own mother's garage as a storage place, and for all this, a check for concealment. It should be noted that the maximum sentence on this charge is 2 years, and 2 years for what she did that night, consistently and step by step. Here a gap arises that everyone who looks into this case feels. Silence and inaction from fright and confusion is one thing. Active participation in concealment, consistent, multi-stage, requiring specific physical efforts is another. And meanwhile, the investigation isn't considering her role more broadly than this. Either there really aren't grounds, or the evidence is insufficient for a more serious classification. The investigation continues, the case isn't closed. And in the practice of such cases, this happens. But for now, she walks the same streets of Kez, past Sonia's house, past the school where everyone knew them both. The head of the investigative department of the Investigative Committee for Udmurtia, Anatoly Tugushev, took the case under personal control. This isn't an ordinary decision. The head of the regional investigative apparatus personally supervises the course of the investigation, with every procedural decision under his direct gaze. But it didn't stop there. Alexander Bastrikin, the representative of the investigative committee of the entire country, demanded a report on this case, a settlement in the north of Udmurtia, and they're reporting on it to the top official of the federal investigative agency of the country. This is a scale that says a lot. Either the case is more complex than it appears on the surface, or the public resonance has reached a level that's impossible to ignore and pretend everything is going its normal course, or both at the same time. When Bastrikin demands a report, this is a signal for the entire vertical. There must be no mistakes. And every examination is under control, every interrogation by protocol, every procedural decision with justification. Pressure from above doesn't guarantee justice. That's important to understand, but it guarantees that not a single detail will go without examination. In Kez, no one slept. The news spread in the first 24 hours, not through official media and not through telegram channels, but through people. The grapevine in a 10,000-person settlement works instantly and without fail. By the morning of March 15th, everyone knew what happened and with whom, and where exactly the garage was where they brought everything. Under Sonia's obituary on social media, hundreds of comments, not from strangers from the internet, but from those who knew her personally. Friends, teachers who saw her every week, and every second one. I knew her. She was friends with my daughter. We lived on the same street, but they knew not only Sonia, they knew the 18-year-old too, his family, his history, his reputation in the settlement. They knew the 16-year-old, her police records and her company, and they knew her mother, whose garage became the final point of the route. In a big city, a crime like this is anonymous, like names in a report, like strangers' fates on a news screen, and here every face is familiar. Sonia, the neighbor girl, the one who did this, the guy from the building across the way, the one who helped conceal it, the former friend. This entire video we've been searching for the answer to the question, why? It hasn't sounded a single time. Not at interrogations, not in court, not in official documents. The time has come to look the truth in the eye. From Kez, with an inclination toward antisocial behavior. We know where, the apartment. We know how, several strikes. And the former friend methodically, step by step, cleaned up the traces. We know when, March 14th. We don't know why. And the version of a drunken outburst doesn't explain how Sonia ended up in that apartment at all. The version of luring hasn't been confirmed by the investigation. He himself says, I don't know. And perhaps that's the truth. Perhaps no motive exists. Not in the sense that it's hidden or hasn't yet been found by the investigation, but in the sense that it simply wasn't there from the very beginning. There was no reason, no plan, no goal. There was a drunken night, a sharp object in the kitchen, and a person for whom one impulse was enough. This is more frightening than any motive because from a motive you can defend yourself, you can predict, you can avoid. But from chance, no. Then it became clear that the most terrifying thing in this story isn't the fact itself, but that no one knows why. Sofia Lekomtseva, September 19th, 2012 to March 14th, 2026, dreamed of healing animals, knew how to stand up for herself, wasn't afraid, and she was 13 years old. What do you think about this video? Write in the comments, subscribe to our channel, leave likes. See you next time. One phone call, and a man who just yesterday was stepping onto a soccer field becomes a tool in someone else's hands. That's exactly how, according to investigators, scammers turned a professional athlete into an instrument that would carry out what they had planned. And it's from this point that the story of the finale begins, a finale that would take place in a residential neighborhood in northwestern Moscow. It happens in March of 2026 in one of the apartments on the upper floors. A woman and her daughter, a high school student. Morning is morning, breakfast, getting ready, nothing that would set this day apart from 100 others just like it. In a few hours, one of them will cease to exist. This is not a metaphor and not an artistic device. This is what will happen in this apartment before the day is over. But to understand what exactly happened here, we have to start not with this apartment, but with a man who at that very moment was 1,000 kilometers away. On the roster of Ural 2, the youth team of the Yekaterinburg club, there's a guy who at that time is 20 years old, with the nickname Sikach. And here's what's important. It's not a street nickname, not the trace of some dark past. It's a sports nickname earned for tough, uncompromising, aggressive play on the field. A young guy who chases the ball and, as will later become clear, desperately hopes to break into the main roster. The youth team. That's not about big money. The salary is most likely modest, family is somewhere far away, and soccer is the only chance at a different life. Not a hobby, not entertainment. Precisely a chance. And here's what this chance does to a person. It shapes the habit of obedience. The coach said it, you did it. The system gave the command, you carried it out. Drilled in over years of training, it sits not in the head, but in the spine. Remember this. Later it will become clear why. This guy is the very one who, within a matter of days, will end up in the apartment of an unknown woman, with an angle grinder in his hands. And it all begins with one phone call. The phone screen lit up with an incoming call from an unknown number. Maybe a landline, maybe a cell. And Sikach picked up. At a certain moment, the exact time of which we are deliberately leaving aside for now, a conversation took place that split his life into before and after. And what exactly was said to him? We'll return to that. And we'll return in detail, because the content of that call is the key to everything that happened next. But right now, it's not about that. It's about what happened to Sikach himself. Before the call, he was that guy from the youth team. An ordinary, understandable, transparent life. And then the receiver went back down. Purposefully, methodically, like a person who has received instructions and does not question them. One conversation, and the man seemed switched over. There was one mode, now there's another. But first, what did he do afterward? In the surveillance camera footage from the train, there's a record. A man of athletic build, confident stride, enters through the main door of an apartment building. The time is recorded, his face is in the frame. He doesn't hide, doesn't look around, doesn't behave like someone who has no business being there. On the contrary, every movement says that he has every right to be there. And there's Sikach at the apartment door, a ring at the door. His voice is even, well-trained. He introduces himself as an employee of law enforcement. Clearly, without stumbling, with the kind of intonations that don't raise questions but elicit obedience. As will later become clear, this cover story had been rehearsed with him in advance, word for word, phrase by phrase, and in what tone. The door is opened by the high school student, the 16-year-old daughter of the woman who lives there, alone in the entryway, alone in the entire apartment. Before her stands an adult, self-assured man who is saying the right words in the right order. People don't ask for his documents because that's how psychology works. When a person says, quote, 0, most people trust him, especially at 16, especially when you're alone and there's no one nearby to tell you otherwise. She let inside a man who had come here with one single goal, to destroy everything that was behind that door. 16 is the age at which the world beyond the threshold of the apartment still divides into understandable adults and not understandable adults. And the first group is the overwhelming majority. The mother, most likely, was in the next room, or perhaps had stepped out briefly. This is a detail that investigators would record later. Evenly, without unnecessary pauses, with that calm confidence that in itself serves as a pass. Perhaps he showed something resembling a document. Perhaps he named the last name of the apartment's owner, a detail that instantly removes the inner barrier, because how would a stranger know such a thing? As will become clear, both the surname and the wording, and even the intonation, all of it had been prepared in advance by the person who sent him there, and at a certain moment, he turned the lock. It's important to understand this is not a mistake, not a slip-up, not a naivety that could have been avoided. A person in uniform or with documents for a 16-year-old is the system, order, the thing you've been taught to trust your whole life. Recognizing a deception in such a situation would have been beyond almost anyone. Not at 16, not at 30, not at 50. She acted exactly the way the absolute majority of people would have acted in her place. And what came next, behind that door, was a nightmare that would stretch on for an entire day. An angle grinder and a crowbar. Two things that don't end up in an entryway by chance. They aren't pulled from a closet in a fit of anger, aren't grabbed from a table in a moment of clouded judgment. They are bought, packaged, transported across the whole city, carried into someone else's building, taken up to the floor, brought through someone else's door past the very high school student who closed it behind him. And here's what makes this detail so unbearable. Each of these objects is a separate, conscious action. And the chain, walking into the store, is a decision, choosing is a decision, paying, carrying it all is a decision. At any of these links, you could have stopped, hung up the phone, thrown away the bag, turned around, and gone back to Yekaterinburg. But the chain didn't break at any stage. So then, the apartment's owner, the mother, would never leave these walls again. What happened to her, investigators would reconstruct from details that cannot be discussed here. A precise address, a person, tools selected in advance, not a single sign of spontaneity, only methodical execution. At a certain moment, it was all over, but he didn't gather his things and leave. He stayed, because there was one more person in the apartment, the one who had let him in several hours earlier. From investigative materials, one figure that doesn't fit any logic, 24 hours. That's approximately how long she remained with him within the same walls, with the awareness of what he had done to her mother in that same apartment, behind that same front door, in those same rooms. And there is no life anymore, but time continues to pass. And they are both here, on opposite sides of what happened. He could have left immediately, in the first few minutes, taken the elevator down, walked out of the building, hailed a taxi, and by morning been in another city. But he didn't leave, didn't gather his things. As would later become clear, he spent 24 hours in that apartment. And this is not speculation, this is data, reconstructed from cameras. He was waiting for something, receiving new instructions from those who had sent him there, or simply froze, like a person who had carried out a command and didn't know what to do without the next one. So then, there is no answer yet. Not in the records, not in his own words, which he spoke significantly later. But the fact recorded by the investigation remains: an entire 24 hours, him and her in the same apartment, and what was established by the end of those hours added to his case another line, about which we'll speak further. The case was opened on several counts, not just one. What he did to the apartment's owner became the first line, but the investigation also established a second, separately classified under a different article, concerning what was happening in those scenes over the course of the day with regard to the daughter. Details here are not appropriate, the fact is recorded in the materials, and that is enough. So then, if up to this point it seemed to you that before you stood a man acting of his own free will, you are mistaken. Everything you've seen so far is not the story of a man who decided. This is the story of a man who was controlled, a marionette whose strings someone was pulling from another city, from the other end of a phone line. In his biography, there's nothing. Literally nothing to grab onto. No psychiatric record, no criminal record, not even an administrative citation. Clean as a fresh card in a database. And here's what turns this story from a crime chronicle into something entirely different. He didn't know this woman, had never been in Strigino, had never crossed paths with her, neither in life nor online, had neither personal scores to settle with her nor financial claims, not a single point of intersection at all. So then there was no motive whatsoever. Investigators searched and didn't find one, because there was nothing to find. A soccer player from Yekaterinburg and a woman, an incoming call on his phone. One conversation, a voice that said the words after which this guy packed his things and traveled across half the country to carry out what he was told. At a certain moment, a question arises that cannot be brushed aside. Who was on the other end? And what, perhaps even more important, did they say that was so compelling that he obeyed? Hundreds of thousands of fraudulent calls, call centers, polished scripts, a conveyor belt set on industrial rails. Your account has been blocked. Confirm the transfer. A debit is being made from your card, phrases that everyone has heard at least once. And here's what's important. Up to this moment, the entire telephone fraud industry operated on one and the same model: a call, escalation of fear, transfer of funds, and the person opened the banking app and handed over the money themselves with their own hands. The scheme closed remotely, without physical contact, without a meeting, without intersections in real space. Here, everything went differently. They didn't ask to transfer money, they found a specific person and sent him across half the country to someone else's building, to someone else's door, with an angle grinder and a crowbar in his hands. Not deceive and take, but find and carry out and deliver. As will later become clear, this was a fundamentally new turn, a shift from remote fraud to remote control of a living person who would carry out what the customer said into the receiver. For such a scheme, you don't need just a random interlocutor, not just a frightened ordinary citizen ready to transfer their savings. You need someone who will obey, who won't ask unnecessary questions, with the same discipline with which he carried out the coach's instructions. And here begins what makes you truly uneasy. Because Sikach wasn't weak, wasn't beaten down, wasn't a person who was easy to break. He was an athlete, accustomed to harshness and pressure. That's exactly why he was chosen. 20 years old and already in a coordinate system where authority isn't questioned. So then, to understand why Sikach in particular ended up in that apartment, we need to examine not his action, but his profile. 20 years old, an age at which self-confidence has not yet formed, but fear of people who present themselves from above has already been instilled. Most likely, he didn't grow up in Moscow, but in the provinces. A different pace, a different attitude toward life under the name of institutions. Where he came from, a voice on the phone identifying itself as someone from law enforcement is not grounds for verification. It's grounds for obedience. And the youth squad, that's not the foundation of the club. Salaries are small, symbolic. And here's what follows from this. With high probability, he depended on this money, possibly helped his family, sent part of it home. Any threat to financial stability in such a situation is not an inconvenience, it's a catastrophe. Loss of the contract equals loss of all of soccer, of income, of the meaning of the move. Most importantly, he was alone. Far from home, without support, without a person nearby whom he could call and say, quote, at a certain moment, when pressure mounts and there's no one around, a person makes decisions that under normal circumstances they would never make. And also athletic discipline, years of training, where the main rule is hammered in at the level of reflex. The coach speaks, you do. You don't discuss, you don't doubt. You carry it out. It's a habit of verticality, of unconditional obedience. And they found their target. But how exactly? And what, perhaps, is most important, how did they know the Strogino address? Here's a detail that doesn't add up at first glance. Sikach is a player for the Ural Club. His life, training, daily routine, all of it is tied to Yekaterinburg, and it happened in Moscow. Between these 2 points there are 1,800 kilometers, and not a single visible reason why this person should have ended up exactly there. What was he doing in Moscow? Perhaps he came for some personal reasons. We don't know for certain. But here's what we do know for certain. He wasn't just talked into it over the phone. He was physically moved across half the country, from one city to another, to a specific building, a specific door, at a precisely calculated time, with tools prepared in advance in his hands. Here arises what makes you truly uneasy. Whoever was on the other end of the line was telling him where to go, where to stop. Someone was directing where to walk. Every step dictated, every movement guided. They moved him like a piece on a board. So then he was sent not just to an address, but to a specific woman. And that meant one thing. The scammers knew who she was, knew her name, her apartment, knew that she would be home, and knew whom to send to her. In the database that investigators would later discover, there was a line with her name, her phone number, and her home address. A specific entry, a specific woman, a specific apartment in Strogino. And here's what this means. Long before Sikach crossed her threshold, they had already been working on her. As will later become clear, the scheme apparently began in the standard way: an incoming call, a well-trained voice, a rehearsed alarm. Your funds are under threat. Transfer them to a safe account. A script that works on thousands of people across the country every day. But this woman didn't fall for it. She hung up, didn't call back, didn't open the banking app, simply refused and went back to her business. So then, for a conveyor belt that runs through hundreds of numbers a day, a refusal. That's ordinary statistics. A line you cross out and move on. But here something different happened. They didn't cross her out. They remembered her. The address remained in the database, the phone in the system, and at a certain moment, someone on the other end made a decision that took this whole story beyond the bounds of telephone fraud. Since she didn't hand over the money herself, they would come to her. This is a theory and it is not officially confirmed, but it fits the logic with frightening precision. If the scammers had her address, that means she was in their field of view. If they had her phone, that means contact had already been made. If there had been an attempt, that means there had also been a refusal, after which they moved on to what investigators would reconstruct minute by minute. They found an executor, passed along instructions: where to go, who to approach, what to say at the threshold. But instructions from them are not enough. You need a reason that would compel a 20-year-old guy to pack his things, board a train, and do what he is told. They don't get yanked from under a sink in a state of passion. They aren't picked up along the way. They aren't found by chance. For them to end up in your hands, a sequence of actions must be carried out, each of which is a separate, conscious point. And here's the detail that doesn't let you rest. Who compiled the shopping list? Apparently, the instructions were not approximate. Not, grab something suitable, not, you'll figure it out on the spot, but specific. Such a tool, such an item, and in such a quantity, a level of detail at which the person on the other end was controlling not the general direction, but every position on this monstrous list, every step between the store and the building entrance. This is not a hint and not advice. This is a step-by-step guide dictated by a voice he had never seen. At a certain moment, you have to stop and realize one thing. Between the phrase, buy an angle grinder, and the moment you take it in your hands and use it for its intended purpose, there's neither a crack nor a gap, but a chasm that a normal person does not cross. At some stage, you must stop, look at what you're carrying, ask yourself a question to which you have no answer, and refuse. Between instruction and action lies that very chasm. As will later become clear, that's precisely what happened. The call details. Here's the document that turned the whole case around. Not testimony, but his phone, with which it all began. Incoming numbers, the duration of each conversation, the exact time of connection, the sequence in which the calls came one after another, methodically, with intervals, like steps of an instruction stretched out over hours. From these numbers, from these lines of detail, from the dry billing data, a picture took shape that investigators would record in the case materials. Sikach did not act on his own. Behind him stood telephone scammers, the kind who usually ask you to transfer money to a safe account, who call thousands of numbers every day and work from scripts. From the testimony, from the call detail records, and from the reconstruction of the chronology, minute by minute, call by call, the very picture takes shape toward which we've been moving from the first block. A picture of how an ordinary guy was turned into an instrument. A 20-year-old guy from Yekaterinburg picks up the phone, and at this very moment, a mechanism launches that can no longer be stopped. A reconstruction based on what is known about similar schemes and what, in all likelihood, was reconstructed in the course of the investigation. An incoming call. On the other end, a voice that identifies itself as an officer of the FSB, or the Interior Ministry, or the Investigative Committee. And here's what's fundamentally important. The specific acronym doesn't matter. For Sikach, for a guy who grew up far from Moscow, it sounds the same, like a verdict. You are listed in the materials of an inquiry. 2 sentences spoken in a calm, confident tone, and already your heart is in your throat, and already your thoughts are tangled, and already the only reaction, what case? I haven't done anything. So then, it's precisely this phrase, precisely this fright, precisely this readiness to justify yourself to an unfamiliar voice that, as it seems, can stop everything. Someone who knows what to do. Someone you just need to trust. At a certain moment, the line between quote 9 and quote 10 is erased. He believed, and as soon as that happened, they moved on to the next stage, the very one after which there is no road back, and to this day this scheme has been reconstructed practically minute by minute. The first, and perhaps most important, isolation. Quote 11. That is how a person is cut off from anyone who might say the one rescue phrase. Quote 12. No friends nearby, no relatives, no coach to whom he was accustomed to listen. All that remains is the voice in the speaker, and this voice becomes the only source. Second, escalation of commitments. Built so that each next step seems logical. First they ask for a trifle, check an address. Just see whether such a house exists. Nothing scary, elementary, he does it. Then a bit more. Walk up to the building. Write down the license plate numbers of the cars in the yard. Also, it would seem, nothing criminal, and at a certain moment he discovers that each completed stage makes refusing the next one less and less possible. You are already inside the process. You are already part of the mechanism, that the woman in this apartment is implicated in serious offenses, that she's storing materials that must be confiscated, or funds obtained illegally, or something without which the operation cannot be completed. So then he was going not to cause harm. In his own perception, he was carrying out an assignment, assisting, doing, as it seemed to him, the right thing. A methodical suppression of doubts. Each time he probably stopped, the voice repeated the same thing. You are already a participant. If you stop now, you'll end up behind bars yourself. We have it all recorded. Fingerprints on the scene. Cameras were working. The trap by this moment had already snapped shut. He couldn't get out, at least it seemed that way to him, and the fifth point, after which there was no way back. He is already in the apartment with tools in his hands. Before him is a woman who doesn't understand what is happening. In his ear is that same voice, and this voice utters the final word, act. The entire chain, from the first incoming call to the final command, is a conveyor belt. Industrial, well-honed, where each stage flows into the next, and each completed turn makes return impossible. He was standing with an angle grinder in his hands, and in the speaker sounded a voice that called it duty. 12 hours later, he was still sitting in that same apartment, in that same spot where the silence in the receiver had caught him. There was no more voice, but he was still there. And this, perhaps, is the most terrifying part of the whole story. There is a theory that the voice on the other end didn't fall silent right away, that they said to him, quote 16. And he, already completely controlled, obediently waited. An hour, 2, 5, 12. No one, of course, came, because no quote 17 ever existed. Or perhaps the connection simply broke off. The phone went silent, and he was left alone in someone else's apartment. With what he had done, with the daughter of the woman who was no more, one-on-one with consequences for which not a single voice from the receiver had prepared him. At a certain moment, and this is probably the most accurate description, the program broke down, the voice disappeared, the instructions ended, and his own will, suppressed by days of continuous pressure, never returned. He didn't know what to do next, couldn't leave, couldn't stay, couldn't make a single decision. The decisions for him had long been made by someone else. What exactly was happening during that 24 hours we don't know for certain. Investigators may have details that have not yet become public, but what is recorded in the materials, and here's what's important to understand, before you is not a black and white picture where it's easy to assign the roles. The victim, the marionette, and the perpetrator, they are one and the same person. This, perhaps, is the main difficulty. As will later become clear, it's precisely here that the most important question begins. At the time of these events, Sikak is 20 years old. He has long been of age, a fully capable adult for whom no one is obligated to make a decision, which cannot be sidestepped. He could have hung up on the first minute of the conversation. On the 10th, on the 40th, at any point in this chain he could have said no, broken off contact, called his coach, his mother, anyone. Any of these calls would have brought the whole scheme down in seconds. So then, this is the main contrast. Every day in Russia, thousands of people receive exactly these same calls. Quote _18 __, and thousands of people hang up. They break the connection, Google the number, laugh, and retell it to their friends as an anecdote. He did not hang up? Manipulation is an explanation, but not an excuse. And the difference between these words here is critical. He was deceived, yes. He was probably broken psychologically, admissible. He was used as a tool, exactly so. But the angle grinder in his hands? It was he who held it, in someone else's apartment. And everything that happened over those 24 hours, he committed. And we are left with a question to which no simple answer exists. Where exactly does the line run between the one who was used and the one who committed the irreparable? But there are those who are unconditionally guilty, and who, most likely, will never answer for it. On the surveillance camera footage, one person. In the case materials, one defendant. Before the court, one accused. But the voices in that story were at minimum two. Somewhere, most likely, far beyond the borders of Russia, in one of the countries of the near abroad, at this very minute, people are sitting in safety, in warmth, with phones at the ready. They did not buy the angle grinder, did not climb the stairs, did not stand at someone else's door. Their fingerprints are on no object in that apartment, not on a single recording. And here's where the whole monstrous situation lies. It was they who found the address, it was they who reached out to Sikash, it was they who, word by word, step by step, led him by voice from beginning to end. They were the architects of everything that happened, and he, the living instrument, because he crossed the threshold and they did not. At a certain moment, you begin to understand the hardest thing. These people did not stop. He is not the first and not the last. And tomorrow there will be another guy or another woman or a pensioner who will believe a confident voice in the receiver. And the mechanism works. And it does not require presence. Somewhere right now, someone's phone is ringing. If they call you, hang up. Dear viewers, today's episode was a request. Do not pick up any phone calls. Don't fall for the story that a criminal case has been opened against you. Please, hang up immediately. If you enjoyed this video, leave a like, subscribe to our channel. Until next time. They called the police and said they had found a little girl on the street, alone, in tears. Only the caller didn't say a single word about how she had actually ended up on that sidewalk in the middle of the night. And so it begins, with this short, almost routine call, a story in which every detail will turn out to be a lie, calm, calculated, delivered in an even voice. May 2025, Krasnoyarsk, the middle of the night. A call comes into the duty station, a male voice on the line, not agitated, not stumbling over his words, but deliberately calm, as if the person had thought through in advance exactly what he was going to say. He reports that there's a little girl on the street, very small, looks about 2 years old, alone, no adults with her, crying. The dispatcher works by protocol. Address, description, is anyone nearby? The man answers in a measured way, even too measured. A man who supposedly just happened to stumble upon a crying toddler in the middle of an empty street. No adults around. No, he has no idea whose child it is. He was just walking by and called. The call lasts less than 2 minutes. At this moment, for everyone involved, it's a routine situation. Some parent let their guard down, the little one got out of the apartment, a patrol unit will arrive shortly, find a bewildered mother nearby, and by morning all of it will dissolve into a written report. But nothing of the sort will happen, because anywhere near that street there will be no bewildered mother, no grandmother who dozed off, no one. Remember this call, its tone, its calculated calmness. 20 minutes before this man dialed the duty station, something happened in an apartment nearby that would turn a routine night call into a case that would make even veteran investigators' hands shake. 4th floor, standard layout. The door is opened by a 43-year-old man. Behind his shoulder, a second man hovers, 61 years old, and both meet the patrol with that particular expression on their faces that people have when they've prepared an explanation in advance. The apartment reeks of alcohol. On a sagging couch is a little girl, about 2 years old, and she isn't crying anymore, just whimpering, quietly, monotonously. The way those who long ago grew tired of calling for help whimper. The first thing that catches the officer's attention. On the phone, the man said he had picked her up off the street. But the child is inside, on a couch, in the warmth. Maybe he brought her in, maybe he felt sorry for her, there's a logical explanation. But that's only at first glance. Because then the second inconsistency begins. Far more troubling. She doesn't move the way children her age move. She has developmental conditions, the kind that require constant care, special attention. This isn't a toddler who ran out of an entryway and got lost in the courtyard. This is a little person who is physically incapable of ending up alone in the middle of a city at night. And here's the third inconsistency. A child with such conditions couldn't have walked away on her own, couldn't have climbed out of a crib, gone down the stairs, crossed the courtyard, which means someone brought her here. It hasn't been said out loud yet. She never left this place to begin with. 2 men stand in front of the patrol unit, both intoxicated, both repeating the same thing. Found her, don't know who she is, that's why we called. The version sounds smooth, but it's already cracking. In the interview report, there will be one dry line. Both of those questioned gave identical statements. That's the key word. The 43-year-old shrugs, we don't know, just found her. The 61-year-old says exactly the same words in the same order, with the same pauses, word for word. When 2 people tell a story in absolutely identical fashion, it's either a truth so elementary that there's no other way to phrase it, or it's a rehearsed version. The duty officer puts out a radio request. Are there any reports of a missing minor in this area? Not a single call. A door-to-door canvass begins, 3 in the morning, and one of the neighbors, an elderly man on the floor below, remembers a detail that will change everything. In the evening, he had heard voices from the apartment above, a woman's voice, young, soft, and 2 men's voices. Then silence fell, and then there was a sound, a muffled thud outside beyond the window. The 4th floor. One of the officers leaves the entryway and walks around the building, following the facade down to the lawn beneath the windows of that same apartment. The grass is flattened, the soil is disturbed, and there, on that lawn, lies a young woman, unconscious, alive, but barely. She looks no older than 20. House clothes? Not the kind you go outside in, but the kind you sit around in inside someone else's apartment. Into the radio. Need an ambulance, urgently. Woman, critical condition, beneath the windows of the building. And from this moment on, the story of we just found her begins to fall apart. Because the man who called the police 20 minutes ago lives precisely on the 4th floor, directly above the spot where a 19-year-old mother now lies. 7 minutes. That's how long it took the ambulance crew. And here they are on scene. 19 years old, multiple fractures, head trauma, internal damage characteristic of a fall from height. The 4th floor, that's about 12 meters, enough to break almost everything inside a person. But there's a brutal paradox in this too. Sometimes it isn't enough for everything to end at once. She was breathing, her heart was working. There was no consciousness, and there probably hadn't been from the very second she stopped falling. In the protocol, condition critical, prognosis uncertain. That's the medical way of saying, we don't know if she'll survive until morning, but we'll do everything we can to make sure she does. She didn't know the context, didn't know that she had a little daughter with special needs, who at that very moment was lying on a couch on the floor above, with 2 intoxicated men involved in what doctors were now trying to put back together as a human being. 2 points on the map of nighttime Krasnoyarsk, 12 vertical meters between mother and daughter. And for now, One fact: the man who called the police knew. He couldn't not have known. For 20 minutes he stayed silent, and in that silence, everything was contained. He lied to the police and uttered a phrase he had prepared in advance, found her on the street. But he didn't say that 4 floors below on the wet lawn lay the 19-year-old mother of that same little girl. He didn't call an ambulance, didn't ask for doctors to be sent. This silence isn't bewilderment, isn't shock. It's a choice. Anyone who witnesses someone falling from a window grabs their phone. Someone is hurt. That means they need help. That doesn't require 20 minutes of deliberation. He didn't call. 20 minutes passed between what happened at the window and the call. 20 minutes, the interval during which brain swelling becomes irreversible, the window between when you can still save someone and when it's already too late, closes with a quiet click. When he finally dialed the number, he called about her. He called about the toddler, the little girl who had to be gotten rid of somehow. He wasn't sleeping. He was disposing. Let's rewind several hours. The same couch, but it's still evening. Down one of the streets, a young woman is walking. She's 19, with a small daughter in her arms. 2 years old, with conditions that mean she can't walk on her own. The mother walks slowly because carrying a 2-year-old in your arms is heavy even for 15 minutes. And she's been walking for a long time. Where? No one knows. From where? Also unknown. A fight with relatives. A rented apartment she can no longer afford. Or maybe she has no one at all in this city. From that long, unbearable, familiar list of reasons why young mothers with sick toddlers end up on the street at night with no roof over their heads, in a country where for every such case there's supposedly a social service, a hotline, a crisis center. They all exist on paper. But on a specific street in a specific city on a specific night, they don't help. May, Krasnoyarsk, at night +5, +7 Celsius. She holds her daughter close and cries because she has nowhere to go, and at that moment she is the most vulnerable person in the whole city. A crying young woman with a toddler in her arms. To some, that's a signal, help. To others, a signal of an entirely different kind. 2 men approached her, 43 and 61. Both had already been drinking. They started talking. The point was simple. We have an apartment, a couch. Lay the little one down, you'll get some rest. It's the middle of the night, where are you going to go? From the outside, an ordinary gesture of concern. She hesitated. Every woman walking alone at night carries within her a rule sewn in since childhood. Don't go with strangers. But this rule has a weakness. It only works when you have an alternative, when you can say no and go home. To stand at a crosswalk with a child in your arms, a child who's going to freeze, when you yourself can barely stay on your feet, the rule stops being protection and becomes a luxury. She agreed, not because she trusted them, but because the choice was a small one. They went up to the 4th floor. The door opened. She walked in. The door closed. The lock clicked. Remember that sound, because before it, there was still a chance, and after it, there wasn't. And the apartment turned out to be exactly like apartments in buildings like this tend to be. Small, minimal furniture, the kind where people don't live, they just crash for the night. The mother laid the little one down on the couch, covered her with whatever she could find, and the child fell asleep almost instantly. And then the mother sat down, for the first time in several hours, possibly longer. She wasn't standing, wasn't walking, wasn't carrying the toddler in her arms. At that moment, she probably thought the hardest part was behind her. But the men brought out a bottle, poured drinks, poured one for her too. It seems harmless. You're in someone else's apartment. They took you in for the night. They did you a favor and now they're handing you a glass. And this isn't an invitation to share a meal. It's a test. She drank, most likely not because she wanted to, but because at 19, alone, in someone else's place with 2 strange men, you instinctively do what you think will lower the temperature, even though every sip carried her further from any possibility of defending herself. They drank, and the men probably asked the usual questions. Where are you from? Why are you on the street? Where's your family? The standard set, behind which can hide concern or cold appraisal. How alone is she? Does anyone have her back? How far can we go? On the couch, the toddler slept. Alcohol blurred the boundaries. muffled the alarm. The night grew deeper. Everything that would happen next would happen behind a closed door. No witnesses, no cameras, not a single chance. The bottle emptied, the intonations shifted. Looks lingered longer than they should have. Phrases sounded more unambiguous. And the two intoxicated men, within their own walls, with the feeling of complete control. Across from them, a 19-year-old also intoxicated, alone, without a phone, possibly without a single acquaintance in this city. The mother couldn't just get up and leave, she had nowhere to go. And they understood that. And at that moment, the first demand was probably voiced. Not a request, a demand. Probably wrapped in that particular logic of debt. We took you in. Be grateful. She tried to refuse, but in an apartment where two drunken men have already decided how the evening will continue, refusal isn't taken as an answer. Refusal is a challenge, a provocation. One of them struck her, didn't push her, didn't raise a hand and reconsider, struck her with a fist with that drunken, sweeping force that doesn't know its own measure. Enough for the 19-year-old to lose consciousness and fall to the floor in the cramped space next to the table with the emptied bottle. A second ago she was still trying to resist, and now an unmoving figure on dirty linoleum. And silence. A blow is the point after which time breaks in two. Before it, things could still be turned around. She could have left, sobered up, and the whole evening would have remained just a bad memory. After it, the unconscious mother is on the floor and two men are over her. They didn't call emergency services. Two grown men stood over an unconscious person and neither reached for the phone. Not because they panicked, but because they were preoccupied with something else. They were thinking about what she would say when she came to, about how this looks from the outside, about what questions the police would ask. Not, a person needs help, but we have a problem, and problems need to be removed. Not long, maybe 5 minutes, but within those minutes was contained what separates a drunken outburst from a deliberate act. This was a decision, not the impulse of one, but the agreement of two. Each of them could have stopped the other. Each could have said, "That's enough, we're calling an ambulance." But neither said it. They walked over to the window, 4th floor, lifted her up. One probably held her by the arms, the other by the legs. 12 meters of empty space to the ground. Below, a lawn, soft soil, not asphalt, and that would turn out to be the only reason she didn't stop breathing instantly. They pushed her out. Free fall. That's less than 2 seconds, less than the time it takes to say one sentence, 2 heartbeats, and the ground. She remained on the lawn, alive in a formal, technical sense, but destroyed from the inside. And the two of them remained, with the little one on the couch, with the empty bottle on the table, with the open window and the empty spot on the linoleum where a minute ago her mother had been lying. They knew what they were doing. They were drunk, but not so drunk as to not understand. A 4th-floor window isn't an exit from a room. It's an endpoint. The toddler was crying with that quiet, exhausted sound that comes when the voice has given out, when there are no more tears, for any human being. The two men weren't doing anything. They had other priorities. The little one had transformed for them from a living being into evidence, the link between the lawn below and this apartment. Without the toddler, you could construct a version. The girl came on her own, fell on her own. But a child with special needs on a stranger's couch is an answer to every question before they're even asked. Between them, a pause. And the question, what do we do? For an ordinary person, there is no such question. You pick her up and call for help. But for those who had ceased to bear any relation to humanity 10 minutes earlier, the question was phrased differently. How do we get rid of her? 20 minutes between the mother's fall and the call to the duty station. Not approximately, exactly 20 minutes because the time of the fall was reconstructed from testimony and the time of the call was logged with second-by-second accuracy. 20 minutes isn't shock. It isn't paralysis. They were sitting in the apartment going through options, calmly, methodically. The first, the truth. But the truth means handcuffs, rejected faster than the others. The second, silence. Don't call, wait it out until morning. But the toddler is crying, the walls are thin, the neighbors will hear, and then the police arrive without warning, and below is what cannot be explained. They chose the third, call the police but about something else. A completely different story. We went outside, and there she was, crying. Simple, clean, no connection. They probably rehearsed the cover story out loud, twice, 3 times, comparing their wording. 20 minutes during which an ambulance could have been called. And so a man's voice dials the number and utters the phrase we've already heard, found her on the street. Crying, which is the only true part. The only lie is that 20 minutes earlier her mother had been pushed out of a window, and he's calling not to help, but to hide. The police will take the toddler, process her, hand her over to social services, and he'll go to sleep. But he didn't account for what was lying beneath his windows, for what was still breathing. A plan thought up by 2 drunk men in 20 minutes of panic. That isn't a plan, that's self-deception. They thought they had cut the story in 2, but the patrol officer who walked around the building and looked down would connect the 2 halves in 30 seconds. In the protocol, there's a detail that says more than any testimony. On the kitchen table, 3 glasses with alcohol, though the residents would insist they had been drinking with just the 2 of them. The investigator reconstructed the picture not in days but in hours. A lie woven together in haste doesn't withstand even light pressure. The first thing, the toddler herself. She's registered, she has a medical file. From the description, she was identified almost instantly. And along with her, the mother, who was already lying in intensive care, brought in that same night from beneath the windows of that same building. The second, the neighbors. Panel walls made them the chief witnesses. Someone had heard voices in the evening, 1 female, 2 male, escalating into shouting. Someone distinguished a heavy sound from the courtyard side. The third, the residents themselves and their versions. At the first serious interrogation, they couldn't explain 3 glasses where supposedly only 2 had been drinking, couldn't explain the woman's jacket on the chair, the little boots in the hallway. Both were detained that same night in that same apartment, and the toddler was wrapped in a hospital blanket and handed over first to medics, then to guardianship specialists. The peaceful beep of a cardiac monitor counted out seconds in the ICU room. On the bed lay the 19-year-old, the same one who several hours earlier had walked through evening Krasnoyarsk with a toddler in her arms. Tubes, IVs, machines that breathed for her for 2 days, 48 hours. She never regained consciousness. 12 meters is serious, but statistics know cases where people came back from worse. Statistics are averages. Behind every average stands a specific fate. She ended up in the left tail of the graph. 2 days later, the monitors showed a flat line. She was 19. She had a little daughter with special health needs. A few days earlier, she had been walking through a nighttime city because she had nowhere to go. She didn't get to see her little girl again, didn't get to learn that they had taken her, that she was safe. She didn't have time. The toddler is now in the system, that same government machine that knows how to feed on a schedule and fill out paperwork by protocol, but doesn't know how to replace the only thing that exists for a 2-year-old. A voice, a heartbeat that means one word, safety. And she has developmental conditions. That same care which by some impossible means was provided by a 19-year-old mother, herself almost a teenager, without money, without housing, without anyone's help. She carried it, alone, she managed. At 2 years old, there's no concept of irreversibility, no understanding that mommy is gone. Mommy isn't coming back. She waits, not consciously, but with that deep, wordless waiting that lives in the habit of turning your head at the sound of footsteps behind the door, in nighttime crying that has no cause. Except one. In the case materials, there's a detail. They didn't take her phone, didn't erase the messages, but they tried to clean up the traces. Complete lack of preparation, and this speaks to the motive more accurately than any testimony. The original plan probably didn't include the window. The 2 men hadn't approached her with the thought of how it would all end. It was more primitive, dirtier. They saw a young, vulnerable, lonely woman, invited her in, plied her with drink, and waited for the evening to develop in a certain direction. The scenario broke down. She refused, and expectation collided with reality. The window isn't a plan, it's panic translated into action, and every subsequent step was an attempt to hide the previous one. They wanted one thing, they got a refusal. And at each decision point they chose the worst option available, again and again until they had hit rock bottom. It was to this very door on the 4th floor that she came that night, clutching her child to her chest. She was 19, she was cold, she was scared. When that door opened, and from the doorway came warmth, a kitchen, a kettle, voices, she stepped inside. Not because she trusted them, but because the nighttime city had left her no other option. The door closed. Only now none of that matters anymore. If this story won't let go of you, subscribe to our channel. Not for the numbers and the algorithms, but so that stories like this don't disappear in the feed between recipes and memes. So that someone remembers, because not to remember means to consent. And consenting to this is not allowed. Hit the like button, subscribe to our channel. Until next time. 8 a.m., Lipetsk, Petropavlovsky Market. A buyer is standing at the entrance, waiting for Lyudmila Fomina. 42 years old, she sells chandeliers and wallpaper here, knows every other vendor. The day before, they had made a deal. Lyudmila would bring sausage at wholesale price. She always kept her word, arrived to the minute, ran her business cleanly. 3 marriages behind her, the market every day, not a single missed shift. She didn't come. Her stepdaughter, Victoria, the daughter of Lyudmila's husband, Alexei Fomin, was supposed to be at school. She's not there either. The apartment on Pobedy Avenue, where the family of 3 lived, is locked. The phone is silent. With the May holidays approaching, neighbors assume they went to the dacha. A day passes, then a second, then a third. The buyer chalks the delay up to a trip. Acquaintances from the market call each other. No one knows anything. Then Alexei Fomin walks into the police station and files a report. His wife and stepdaughter are missing. He's distressed, says he's driven around to relatives, called acquaintances, visited nearby villages. The police accept the report and begin a preliminary inquiry. 24 years later, the Oktyabrski District Court of Lipetsk will establish that by the time the buyer was waiting at the market, both of them were already gone. Their remains would never be found, not in 2001, not 20 years later. During that time, Fomin lived in a neighboring city, raised a new son, and acted as if nothing had happened. To understand how 2 people disappeared from an apartment without a trace, you have to go back one day. Everything added up, except for one small detail. Igor Churilov, Lyudmila's son from her first marriage, never made it inside that night. He had come over on the evening of May 6th, the holiday weekend, to visit his mother. He knocks on the door. From the other side, a voice answers, "Come back tomorrow." He shrugs and leaves. He had long grown used to the oddities of this family. He knew his mother and Fomin were falling apart at the seams. Lyudmila had been complaining to her closest friend that her husband was being unfaithful. She had lost a lot of weight from stress over the past few weeks. She uttered a phrase her friend would remember word for word. "Our family life is over. Olga is going to break us up." Victoria kept a personal diary. Arguments between her mother and stepfather, shouting, accusations, doors slamming. She recorded what the adults preferred not to notice. That diary would later be seized during the search of the apartment. It would become one piece of evidence of a mounting conflict. Igor went home without suspecting anything serious. Infidelity by a stepfather is one thing. That Fomin was capable of something else simply didn't register. Behind that closed door, by that point, something had already happened that crossed out the lives of 2 people. The kitchen table, a family table with unscrewable legs, wooden with a metal rod at the end. Fomin had lived in that apartment for years and knew its construction by heart. He struck Lyudmila with one of those legs no fewer than 3 times to the head. Traumatic head injury. Lyudmila did not survive at the scene. Victoria was nearby and saw what was happening. Fomin struck her with the same object no fewer than 2 times to the temple. The 14-year-old stepdaughter stopped breathing. That very table had appeared in every family photo. Holiday meals, celebrations, ordinary dinners. The linoleum and the concrete floor beneath it absorbed evidence. There was a great deal of it, every drop. And in the night between May 6th and May 7th, Fomin wrapped both of them in sheets, loaded them into his Lada, drove out along the Lipetsk-Uzman highway near the village of Traktorostroitli. By a tree line he stopped, dug a pit, and buried them. He returned before dawn. At the market, at the school, the buyer stood at the entrance, not understanding the delay. Fomin at that moment was at home alone. The apartment looked ordinary, except for stains on the floor he had not yet had time to hide. Over the next 5 days, he constructed the story of their disappearance step by step, methodically, like a man who knows exactly that one mistake in a detail and everything falls apart. And meanwhile, Fomin launches his performance. On May 9, 2001, he gets to work on the wallpaper. Fomin tears it down in the kitchen and the hallway, ripping it halfway up the wall. He stages a renovation that did not exist before that date. Neighbors and acquaintances would later confirm that before Lyudmila and Victoria disappeared, the wallpaper was in place and no renovation was planned. The tearing happened between May 9th and 10th, after the apartment had already been emptied. In parallel with the renovation, Fomin dismantles the stepdaughter's room, sells the furniture, the wardrobe, the shelves, gives away Lyudmila and Victoria's personal belongings to acquaintances. He cleans the apartment of any presence of either of them, as if they had never lived there. The table with unscrewable legs, the one that appeared in every family photo, vanished without a trace. On May 10th, Fomin drives to the village of Plastinki, supposedly to look for his wife and stepdaughter. He calls common acquaintances, questions them, acts nervous, asks them to call back if they hear anything. He builds the image of a husband in a panic over his missing spouse. In reality, Fomin was destroying evidence. The torn wallpaper concealed brown smears on the walls left over from the evening of May 6th. The sold furniture and the distributed belongings removed any reminder of those who were no longer there. And the trip to Plastinki created an alibi, a caring husband who was the first to raise the alarm. Fomin did what guilty parties usually avoid. He went to the police himself. He walks into the station and lays the report on the desk. The version is rehearsed. Lyudmila left with some acquaintance from Petrovsky Market and took Victoria to a friend in Plastinki. Who this acquaintance is, he doesn't specify. He can't name him. He says he saw the car. The make, color, plate. He doesn't remember. They question him. And on the very first interview, Fomin starts to stumble. First, they left with a bag. Then he corrects himself. No, with shopping bags. He specifies that Lyudmila left on her own, but then changes the route. Sometimes from home, sometimes from the bus station. The details drift. Each new formulation slightly contradicts the previous one. The investigation logs the report and works through the leads. First, debts. According to acquaintances' testimony, Lyudmila owed about $1,700. By 2001 standards, a serious sum, but manageable for a market vendor. Second, abduction. One of the creditors could have taken both of them away. Third, flight. Lyudmila supposedly was getting ready to go to Poland with merchandise, urgently. Each version looked plausible and led the investigation away from the apartment where everything had happened. Detectives fanned out to addresses, creditors, market contacts, possible routes. Fomin outwardly behaved as expected, anxious, answering questions. From the outside, a grief-stricken husband who didn't understand what had happened to his family. But even then, in the apartment, traces remained that disproved any of these versions. They simply didn't have time or didn't want to read them. Lyudmila's international passport was lying in a dresser drawer. The Poland trip theory crumbled instantly. You can't go abroad without documents. Victoria's watch, the one she never went out without, was lying on the shelf. Warm clothes belonging to both of them, jackets, were hanging in the closet. No one leaves their outerwear behind when going away for long in May. A separate detail. On May 20th, Victoria had a paid school excursion to St. Petersburg. The money had been turned in among the first. She had been looking forward to that trip. Someone who was saving up for Peter and counting down the days would not have voluntarily left 2 weeks before. The apartment inspection produced more. On the kitchen linoleum, marks not left by household dirt. On the concrete floor underneath, the same, absorbed deep. A scrap of wallpaper with brown smears was seized as physical evidence for storage. Each of these findings pointed to one thing: no one left this apartment. They disappeared from it. Without documents, without belongings, without watches, without plans. The investigation logged everything into the file. The scrap was packed, the passport was photographed, but the conclusion this was leading to was never drawn. Everything lay on the surface. They couldn't or wouldn't tie it together. 2001. Foman is called in for a second interview, the second one that month. He muddles, changes formulations, gets confused on the chronology, names different details about his wife's departure. The investigator logs the contradictions in the report, but it didn't go further than questioning. No search of the apartment, no expert examination of the marks on the floor, no inspection of the car. 2 interviews in 2 months, and that was all. No face-to-face confrontation, no cross-examination, no detailing of phone records. He remains in the status of a witness. The family conflict is on the record, but classified as domestic. Lyudmila's financial problems, the debts, the market. The third marriage seemed a more likely motive for flight than for anything else. Victoria's diary, seized from the apartment, contained entries about arguments, shouting, reproaches, tensions. But in 2001, those pages probably did not become the decisive argument. Domestic conflicts are nothing rare, and everyone shut it down. No suspect, no progress, and the file went into the archives. Fomin walked out of that story clean. A witness who helped the investigation, drove around looking for his wife, called acquaintances. Not a single charge. Over the next 19 years, he lives as if nothing had happened. Fomin leaves Lipetsk. New address: the city of Vidnoye in the Moscow region. Different region, different people, different life. Gets a job, rents a place, starts from zero, takes a new wife. A son is born. Fomin becomes a father, a husband, an ordinary resident of a bedroom community. In Vidnoye, no one knew that his previous wife had disappeared along with her daughter. No one asked why he had moved. To neighbors and co-workers, simply Alexei, a family man. Nothing remarkable. Morning, work, home. The years went by, and the distance between Fomin and that evening on Pobedy Avenue grew with each month. He didn't change his name, didn't hide, lived openly under his own name with real registration. The case lay dead, suspended, which meant formally open, not a single new investigative action. The file gathered dust in the archive. Lyudmila and Victoria's relatives lived without answers. Lyudmila's mother waited for any kind of news. Her son Igor remembered that evening, May 6th, the closed door. The voice through it suggesting he come back tomorrow. He walked past the apartment on Pobedy Avenue, which now stood empty. Years turned into decades. Victoria would have turned 20, then 25, then 30. The excursion to Peter that she had been waiting for had long since become just a line in a school journal. 19 years. A whole lifetime. And someone at the investigative committee had not forgotten after all. A suspended criminal case is a legal limbo. Not closed. You can't put a period on it, but not being worked either. No suspect, no new data, no grounds for active steps. Such cases are called cold cases. They lie for years, sometimes decades. This case had a peculiarity that made it almost hopeless. The place where the remains had presumably been concealed, the tree line near the village of Traktorostroitly, had changed beyond recognition over 20 years. Trenches were dug there, utilities laid, earth excavated. The landscape had been turned over several times. Even if someone pointed to the exact spot, finding anything would be practically impossible. The weapon, the table leg with the metal rod, had vanished. No physical evidence tying a specific person to a specific act remained. Direct evidence, zero. The scrap of wallpaper with the brown stains was formally on file in storage, a legal dead end. Without a weapon, without a suspect, the case existed only on paper, a gray folder in the archive. But in 2020, the investigative committee launched a program to review unsolved cases. They pulled the folder off the shelf and started reading it anew. On September 17, 2020, the investigative committee officially resumes the investigation into the disappearance of Lyudmila Fomina and Victoria Yashova. An analytical group receives the file and reads the materials from page 1. A fresh perspective changes everything. The 2001 protocol now reads like an indictment. The contradictions in Fomin's testimony arrange themselves into a system. The destruction of evidence, the sold furniture from the stepdaughter's room, was not a move, but a cleansing. The vanished table, not a replacement of something old, but the elimination of a weapon. The international passport at home, the watch on the shelf, the paid excursion to Peter, everything pointed to one thing. No one had voluntarily left that apartment. The analysts build a profile. The only person who was in the apartment on the evening of May 6th was Fomin. The only one who changed his versions. The only one with a motive. An apartment from which he had been crossed out during privatization. A marriage on the verge of breaking up. A wife who openly discussed divorce. They locate Fomin in Vidnoy, 19 years under his own name, not hiding, working, raising a son. He's summoned for questioning as a suspect, for the first time in the entire history of the case. He arrives, sits down opposite the investigators. On the desk is a folder of materials, and he does what nobody expected. He starts to talk. He gives a confession on camera, on the record, with a lawyer present. He describes the evening of May 6th the way only someone who had been inside the apartment could describe it. He names the weapon, the table leg with the metal tip. He names the number of blows. He explains why his stepdaughter became a victim. She had seen what happened to her mother. He describes how he wrapped them both in sheets, how he loaded them into the car, how he drove along the nighttime highway, how he dug near the tree line. The details came one after another, dense, concrete, without pauses, and each one matched the evidence. The marks in the kitchen, the torn wallpaper, the missing table. Fomin knew things an outsider could not have known. The layout of the rooms, the type of floor, the construction of the table, the route. After the questioning, a polygraph. The result indicated knowledge of the final minutes of their lives. The polygraph readings matched the confession on all key points. The investigative team heads to the site, the tree line by Traktorostroitli. Fomin points to the plot. The digging begins. Day 1, Day 2. 20 years of earth moving had passed over this spot. The remains were not found. A case that had stood still for 20 years got more in a single interrogation than in all previous investigations. A confession on video, polygraph confirmation. It seemed the point was placed. But Fomin changed his mind. He retracts all his testimony in full. He declares that he had incriminated himself under pressure from investigators. His version: they drove him around the city for 8 hours, didn't let him drink, didn't let him eat, put a bag over his head. He claims he signed the protocol in a state in which he would have signed anything, and he demands the interrogation be declared unlawful. The lawyer supports his position, testimony obtained in violation of procedure. The investigative committee conducts a review. They examine Fomin. Not a scratch, not a bruise, not a sign of physical impact. They pull up the video recording of the interrogation. Fomin speaks calmly, coherently, without signs of stress. He answers questions, himself adds details that the investigator hadn't asked about. An expert psychologist documents the behavior as consistent with voluntary testimony, no signs of pressure detected. Legally, retracting testimony is the lawful right of the accused. Fomin exercised it. The confession given in September formally ceased to be in effect. Now on the investigation's desk is a video recording the author has disowned. No remains, no weapon, no active confession. With this set, the case was sent to court. The prosecution was built on a single foundation. On the recording, Fomin named details that only someone who had been in the apartment that evening could know. The question stood point blank: would that be enough for a verdict? In 2021, Fomin's case goes to court. The prosecution lays out everything it has: the video recording, the confession, the polygraph results, testimony of witnesses, neighbors, acquaintances, those who saw the renovation and the sale of furniture. The chain is built on the totality. Each fact on its own can be explained, but together they point to one spot. The defense works from the opposite. The remains have not been found. The fact of death is not proven. The weapon vanished. Expert examination is impossible. The confession has been retracted. Direct evidence, none. The court makes a decision that shocks both sides. The episode with Victoria is excluded from the charges. The judge classifies it as a non-premeditated act, not attributable to the defendant. Only Lyudmila remains. June 2022. Sentence: 10 years. The prosecution, it seemed, had achieved a result. But Fomin did not go to a penal colony. The judge immediately applied a mechanism that crossed it all out. Between the act and the verdict, 21 years had passed. The law allows 15. Time had run out. 10 years on paper, 0 days behind bars. Fomin stood up, put on his jacket, and walked out of the courtroom a free man. 21 years of investigation, and he was again walking home. The mechanism that saved Fomin works simply. For serious cases, the law sets 15 years from the moment of commission. If during this time the guilty party is not convicted, liability is lifted. Fomin did what he did in 2001. The verdict was handed down in 2022. 21 years, 6 over the limit. The key question: had he been evading the investigation? If so, the term is paused. But Fomin lived openly. Real name, real registration, work, family. He didn't change documents, didn't hide, didn't travel abroad, paid taxes, enrolled his son in kindergarten, received his salary on a card, formally available for any investigative action at any moment. The court found that he had not evaded, and therefore the statute of limitations ran uninterrupted. This meant one thing: time had been working for Fomin from the very start. Every year of investigative inaction was in his favor. Every month the folder sat in the archive brought closer the moment when the law would stand in his defense. And that moment had arrived long before the case was pulled off the shelf. For Lyudmila and Victoria's relatives, this was a blow. The court found him guilty and immediately let him go. Admission of guilt without punishment. The prosecution left the courtroom with a single intention: to appeal. The main argument: the trial court had erred in excluding the episode with Victoria. If the qualification were restored to cover both victims, it changed everything. Two persons is no longer simply serious, but especially serious. For especially serious cases, the law provides a different mechanism. The court has the right not to apply the statute of limitations, not obligated but entitled. A second trial. A new judge studies the material and hears the parties. The prosecution argues that the witness had been eliminated deliberately. The defense objects: there is not enough evidence of intent. The first court reasonably excluded that episode. Changing the qualification on the basis of the same materials is legally untenable. The result is again in Fomin's favor. The case is dismissed due to the running of the statute of limitations. The defendant did not evade. The deadlines have been missed. Fomin walks free a second time. The prosecution appeals again. This time, cassation. The complaint goes to Saratov, the first cassation court of general jurisdiction, the last instance that can turn the case around. If it refuses, Fomin is free for good. 24 years wasted. The case went to cassation and came back utterly different. The first cassation court of general jurisdiction. The prosecution builds its argument anew. Two lower courts applied the statute of limitations automatically, whereas the judge could have refused to apply it given the nature of what was done. The central point: Victoria became a victim not by chance. She was in the apartment and saw what had happened to her mother. Fomin eliminated the witness deliberately. The Saratov court sends the case back. The qualification is restored. Actions in respect of two persons, the second to conceal the other. Fomin, having twice walked free, again sits on the defendant's bench. The third trial. The case goes to the Oktyabrski District Court of Lipetsk. Judge Olga Luzginova. Before her, two of her colleagues had handled it. Both had released the defendant. Now the decision rests with her, the third and final attempt by the system to see the case through. The judge starts the proceedings from zero, full qualification, actions involving two persons, element by element. The first block, the apartment, marks on the kitchen floor documented in 2001, the wallpaper renovation 3 days after the disappearance, the table with unscrewable legs vanished without a trace, the furniture from the stepdaughter's room sold, the personal belongings of both given away. The second block, Fomin's behavior, confusion in his testimony, a bag or shopping bags, the bus station or from home, the demonstrative trip to Plastinki, the performance of a worried husband, 3 layers of masking in 5 days. The third block, the video recording, the confession. On camera, Fomin describes what only a person who had been inside the apartment could know. The construction of the weapon, the sequence of actions, the method. None of these facts had appeared in open sources. None could have been prompted by the investigator. Too specific. The defense parries, no remains found, no weapon found, the confession retracted, no direct evidence, and the court hears both sides. Session after session, the trial stretches over weeks. No single piece of evidence is a verdict. But together, they form a picture that has only one explanation. The scrap of wallpaper with the brown stains, seized in 2001, packed and signed. Upon resumption, the physical evidence had simply vanished from storage. An expert examination is impossible. One of the few physical traces had evaporated. No remains found. The prosecution was betting on the video. The man who knows everything is the one who did it. The defense answered, the recording was obtained under pressure. Everything else is conjecture. Judge Luzginova was preparing to deliver the decision. The defense counted on acquittal. The 2 previous trials had ended in their client's favor. The prosecution was not certain of anything. Closing arguments. The prosecution requests the maximum possible sentence. The prosecutor lists 24 years since the act, 3 trials, 2 dismissals on the statute, a cassation that returned the case, and 1 question, when? The prosecutor reminds the court of its right to refuse application of the statute of limitations for especially serious cases. He underscores that Fomin did not merely commit one act. He eliminated a witness and lived off the result for 19 years. The defense addresses the court before the defendant's last word. The evidence base, only circumstantial evidence. They remind the court of the presumption of innocence and pledge to appeal any guilty verdict up to the Supreme Court. Fomin stands and delivers his last word. Most likely he repeats the defense's position. The confession was given under pressure, he incriminated himself, he is innocent. He speaks of his new family, of his son, of a life built over these years. 24 years, enough time to rehearse a version to automatic perfection. He knows that 2 courts have already taken his side. Luzginova closes the arguments and announces the date for the verdict. Fomin leaves the building on bail for the last time. The system had let him go twice. There might not have been a third chance, neither for the prosecution nor for those waiting for an answer. March 3, 2025. The hall of the Oktyabrski District Court of Lipetsk. Judge Olga Luzginova comes out and begins reading the verdict. Alexei Fomin stands behind glass in the same hall from which he had twice walked out free. Guilty, on both counts. Actions in respect of 2 persons, the second to conceal the first. The court refused to apply the statute of limitations. The nature and gravity of what was done preclude release from liability. 11 years of strict regime confinement. The bailiffs approach Fomin right in the hall, the click of handcuffs on his wrists. The first in 24 years, 3 trials, 2 dismissals, cassation in Saratov, and now medal on his hands. Fomin leaves the hall not through the main exit, but through the service corridor into the prisoner transport van. A case built without remains, without a weapon, on a retracted confession, ended in a guilty verdict. The totality of facts, traces in the apartment, the renovation, confusion in testimony, outweighed the absence of direct evidence. The lawyers announced their intention to appeal. But that evening, for the first time in 24 years, Fomin did not go home, did not call his wife, did not put his son to bed. He spent the night in a cell in that very Lipetsk he had once left. The remains of Lyudmila and Victoria were never found, but their story was finally heard. What do you think about this video? Write in the comments, leave a like, subscribe to our channel. See you next time.